night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Good evening, good morning, and welcome. It is Beyond Reality Radio. I'm your host, J.V. Johnson. Jason is off tonight. Thanks for being here. A little bit of trouble getting the show started this evening. Just a lot of computer. I don't know. You know, I wanted to start the show off by talking about the tragedy, and this is a tragedy beyond definition in Paris today, as the nearly millennia-old, 850-year-old Cathedral of Notre Dame effectively burned to the ground. Now, reports are starting to come out that much, or maybe, hopefully it's much of the precious artwork and religious relics that were housed in Notre Dame were saved. I mean, you can't believe, you don't know what to believe, but I am praying, and I don't do that often, frankly, that that's the truth, and much of that stuff was saved. The structure itself looks as though they may be able to rebuild it, and that would be wonderful as well. But man, watching that today, my heart was in my throat. There were tears in my eyes. I've been to Notre Dame many times. I've been in Paris half a dozen times, and each time I'm there, I go and spend a great deal of time at Notre Dame. And it is just a magical place, whether you're religious or not. It is just an unbelievable, if nothing else, it was an unbelievable work of art. And a testament to what people can do when they work together. I mean, you know, in the 12th century, they began construction of that cathedral. And over 100 years it took to build it. Of course, things have been done to it since. But just watching that today, I was in disbelief, and as I know people around the world were. So, I wanted to start by saying that, and I'm hoping that, and if we get any information about this, I'll make sure to pass it on. But I'm hoping that there will be a worldwide effort to raise money to rebuild Notre Dame, and if that's the case, we'll talk about it on this program. We'll see what we can do to help that effort. I know that a tremendous amount of money was raised for St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. And I think we can do the same thing. It'll take a lot more money, but will be a worldwide effort to raise money. And again, I'm hoping that as these reports get cleared up and the news comes through with verifiable sources, that we'll find out that much of what would be considered irreplaceable artwork and holy relics were saved. Fingers crossed there. But in addition to that, today I sit down to do my normal show prep and get things ready for the show here, and just everything is just kind of a little bit of a whack. I think we probably need to have an astrologer on and maybe talk about what's happening with the stars, because something's out of line. Something's not right. Things are just a little bit haywire around here. The good news is we have a really, really interesting show for you tonight. This is going to take the paranormal and combine it with something that just about everybody loves, and that would be considered pop music, or rock and roll specifically, but also pop culture. Our guest tonight will be George Case. He's an author, and he has a book out called Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture from 1966 to 1980. This is going to be a great topic. We're going to be talking about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and movies and books. And, we all know that The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby fell into that time frame, as well as the Amityville Horror, both book and movie. I mean, when you think about the 70s in particular, but starting in the mid-60s with what we would consider to be a cultural revolution, which started with music, I believe, there was a lot of flux. There were a lot of people exploring a lot of really interesting ideas. And we're going to have that conversation with George Case tonight. He's written a bunch of books, and this is the one we're going to be talking about. Again, it's called Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult Haunted Music, movies and pop culture, 1966 to 1980. Just taking a look at the rest of the week, we've got Gloria York joining us tomorrow night. She's the author of a best-selling book called Medical Manslaughter, Will Your Doctor Cause Your Death? It's a true story based on her husband's death by medical error. Gloria outlines many supernatural experiences that took place in the book, and she talks about what she describes as 6 miracles that also took place during the ordeal. Wednesday night's program, John Barber is a Hollywood legend, the godfather of reality TV. He's an actor, a comedian, a TV host, and an author. And we'll be talking about the Garrison tapes, the never-before-seen documents provided by James Garrison. Of course, he was the district attorney of New Orleans who prosecuted Clay Shaw as the only person ever tried for the assassination of JFK. Of course, Lee Harvey Oswald was killed before he could stand trial. And the movie JFK was actually based on James Garrison's work. If you've seen JFK, which I think is a great movie, although there is a lot of dispute as to how much of it is fiction and how much of it is fact, but the movie is a great movie. And it was based on James Garrison's book called On the Trail of the Assassins. But our guest Wednesday night, John Barber, will be talking about this information that was not released previously, and it is now being released, and he's analyzed it. And then Thursday night's program, in the first hour, Jody Dean will be with us. Jody Dean is a paranormal investigator, a full-time paranormal YouTuber, even catching a full-bodied apparition during a live YouTube stream. That is going to be interesting. And in the second hour of the program Thursday, Ronnie Dawson, he's a UFO experiencer, an alien contactee, and an author. He's also an alien home invasion survivor, an alien sexual encounter survivor, and a dimensional Stargate experiencer. That is in the second hour of Thursday night's program, Ronnie Dawson. So you can see we have a really great lineup of shows for you this week. Before we get to our break and then get ready to bring in our guest tonight, George Case, there are a few things I wanted to remind you of. One is Scaricon is coming up, and I've talked about Scaricon a lot. I know you've heard some ads for it. It's June 7th through the 9th in Framingham, Massachusetts. That's right outside of Boston. And the event is going to feature about a dozen celebrities, a bunch of parties, a bunch of panel discussions and question and answer sessions, a wide variety of terrific vendors, a lot of great socializing with people who enjoy paranormal and horror pop culture, whether it's movies, books, TV, whatever it happens to be. And one of the celebrities that was announced, but we haven't talked about much, is Billy Zane. Billy Zane is going to be a headlining celebrity at Scaricon in June. And Billy, of course, known probably best for his role in Titanic. I think it was Cal. Cal was the name of the character. He was the rich, kind of snobby guy that was engaged to, what's her name's character there? I should know this. I probably should have written it down. Yeah, but I'm not coming up with it. You know I'm talking. The one that ended up with Jack, or Don't Let Go, Jack, that one. So Billy Zane is going to be, and he was also the Phantom. He's been in a ton of stuff, and he'll be a headliner for Scaricon New England coming up June 7th through the 9th in Framingham, Massachusetts. If you have any inkling in checking it out, go to Scaricon.com, because there's a lot more and many other celebrities that'll be on hand, including Elvira, Cassandra Peterson, who plays Elvira. She'll be part of the show. Kate Winslet, thank you. Somebody helped me out there. Elvira, Cassandra Peterson will be there to sign autographs as well. She's a tremendous woman, very, very funny, very graceful, and she was at Scaricon last year, and I'm looking forward to having her back. We have invitations for you. Of course, I want you to go to the YouTube channel. If you haven't discovered that yet, just go to JV Johnson on YouTube. Give that a subscribe if you would. Also, Facebook, JV Johnson there, or you can find it by typing in JVJ Paranormal. And I think I should hopefully congratulate most of you that today is tax day. So hopefully you were all able to get your taxes filed. and get that nightmare out of the way. I just can't stand it. I mean, I do extension every year because it's just too complicated. But at what point are we going to get to a tax code where it doesn't take you 4 months and a headache and 17 accountants and record keeping out the wazoo to be able to pay your tax? It's just crazy. It's insane. Anyway, that's going to be it for my preaching tonight. Again, I just want to send out my thoughts, prayers, really to the world, but specifically to the French people and the citizens of Paris who watched one of their landmarks. Landmark doesn't even begin to describe it. Burn almost to the ground today. The world was in disbelief, and the world is in solidarity with you. And hopefully we can all work together to raise money so that we can rebuild Notre Dame to its glory. That's going to do it for all of that stuff. I'm going to take a break now. We'll get our guest on the line. George Case will be joining us. He, again, is the author of a book that's called Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture, 1966 to 1980. It's Beyond Reality Radio. Please support the program. Go to patreon.com/Johhaw. That's JOHAW. Tonight we're going to be talking with George Case. We're going to bring him in just a second and talk about his book called Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture, 1966 to 1980. There are a couple things I want to mention because I was trying to come up with the name of the character that Cal, who Billy Zane played, was engaged to, and Kate Winslet was the actress, and Rose Dawson ended up being her name, although it wouldn't have been Dawson early in the film because she took Jack's name. He was Jack Dawson, if I remember correctly. The other thing I wanted to mention in speaking about this Notre Dame fire, tragic fire, is that there's been some reports of a connection, not necessarily a connection, but some people believe that Nostradamus predicted this. And we haven't really talked about Nostradamus on this program at any length, but we've reached out to a few people who are Nostradamus experts, and we're hoping to get one of them on tomorrow night to talk about this possible prediction by Nostradamus and what it may mean if it in fact is what some people are saying it is. So we're working on that. Hopefully that'll be part of tomorrow night's program if we can make it happen. But in the meantime, George Case is our guest tonight. He's an author, and we welcome to the program. George, welcome to Beyond Reality Radio. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for calling.
All right, so let's learn a little bit about you first. This is a particularly short segment, so you don't have a lot of time. But you're an author. You've written about a lot of things. At what point did you decide you were going to write for a living?
Well, I've been writing for years, all my life, and I've had a number of things published since I was in my late 20s, early 30s. I tend to focus a lot on cultural history, cultural theory. So I've written about Led Zeppelin, I've written about rock stars of the 60s and 70s, and then writing about the occult in the 1960s and 70s seemed to be like sort of a logical extension because that's the specialty that I've developed over the years.
And obviously, there are a lot of things you could choose to write about. When you start writing about pop culture topics, there's kind of a mystique about that, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's something that we're all part of, right? Like, everyone watches movies, everyone looks at TV, everyone listens to music, so we're immersed in it. But I think it's interesting to look into the actual nuts and bolts of why these things become popular or not, or influential or not. And let's go into the backstory of some of it instead of just letting it wash over us and consuming it. Let's think about it a little bit more because there's no escaping it for anyone who's alive these days. We're all around it.
And you bring up a great point about everybody being exposed to it, whether it's music, movies, books, or other forms of pop culture. What would you say is the most influential of those? I mean, I think I know what I believe it is. I want to hear what you think of the genres there. Which is the most influential?
Well, these days now, I would probably say I think it's the web. It's the internet. I mean, everyone is walking around with a phone on them. Maybe 20 years ago I would have said TV, and 40 years ago maybe movies. Still 50 years ago, it's changed over time with technology, right? But today I think we're all sort of wired into something. So as the media will change, but I think it's also important to think of the messages that we're we're getting through it, like what is popular, what kind of shows or books or ideas we're engaging with over the years.
I don't think anybody could have predicted how monumental the change would be with the digital age. I think that was a complete game changer. It wasn't an evolution; it was a revolution. So a lot of everything is kind of in play at this point. Does the move to digital reduce or increase the impact of any of these forms, music, television, movies, on us as members of what we would consider to be pop culture?
Yeah, I think it's made it so much more accessible now, right? Because we can carry it around with us, and there's so much that's available out there. That has grown exponentially, whether it's text, like the printed word, whether it's music, songs, like even just going on something like YouTube, you can find so much obscure stuff, like an old record or TV show that you'd forgotten about and thought you would never come across. Well, now it's all there. So we've got this huge repository in front of us for everyone, and it's sort of fragmented all of the public. Like, it wasn't just that you used to have 3 TV channels and that everyone had to choose between them. Now there's a million TV channels, right? It's not just that there's a pop chart and a country chart and an R&B chart. There's an infinite number of music charts that people can get into. So there's so much we can specialize our taste so much because of the range that's out there electronically. It's no longer just radio or TV or books. It's this whole medium of the internet that really, like you say, it's a revolution. We're still in the middle of it.
Yeah. Please support the program. Go to patreon.com/Johhaw. That's JOHAW. I'm JV Johnson. Our guest tonight, George Case. He's the author of a book called Here's to My Sweet Satan: How the Occult Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture, 1966 to 1980. We will be taking your phone calls later in the show at 844-687-7669. George, before the break, I'd asked you what your opinion was as to which of the different media in pop culture may have been the most influential, and you talked about the digital age today, which I think you're absolutely right. We can't even compare with how influential digital media platforms are. And you mentioned movies and TV. And do you think that music was more influential in this time period that we're going to be talking about, 1966 to 1980?
Yeah, I think back then, I mean, obviously you had the baby boom generation, which was a huge demographic wave, and their big thing was rock and roll. Like, they were the ones who made the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all these people really popular. They were these huge entertainment forces at the time. So, yeah, and I don't know if music still has the same sway now. There's obviously still a lot of music stars, but at the time, the music industry was huge dollar-wise in a way that it probably isn't now, because so much is streaming and people are accessing so much stuff free. But the reason rock stars became rich and famous was because of the way the music was being retailed back then. So in the 60s and 70s, yeah, I would definitely put music as a pretty important medium for just conveying ideas and social change, and as an index to how people were thinking, how young people were thinking, for sure.
And I think of two forces now. The first of the two is kind of pre this era we're going to be talking about, however, was still influential, and that's Elvis Presley. And then the Beatles in the early 60s through 1970, basically. It's hard to compare any other pop culture phenomena with those two musical influences. Elvis changed everything, and then the Beatles changed everything again. What is the platform? Was music responsible for providing that change through these artists, or are these just two very, very distinct cases of pop culture influencing people?
Well, I think the other factor here was economics, too. It was the fact that a lot of young people, it was a very prosperous time. It was this big post-war economic boom, so you had a lot of young people with discretionary income. So instead of waiting for their parents to buy stuff, the kids had the opportunity to buy their own entertainment, which was rock and roll, Elvis, Beatles, all the people who came after them. So, yeah, they were huge because of a wider situation, but on the other hand, you have to hand it to the individual artists and say that, yeah, they were also influential, they were special, they did have something unique that they were bringing to the market that other artists before them just weren't bringing. So there was kind of a perfect wave of what the audience wanted and what the artists were delivering at that time. And with Elvis and the Beatles, yeah, you are talking about some pretty big talents and pretty big game changers.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, economics and cultural mood at the time, obviously has a big part to do with it. But I'm not sure what the numbers were, but last night was it last night the premiere of the last season of Game of Thrones? Okay.
Oh yeah.
A big cultural, pop cultural event. And Game of Thrones is one of the most popular television shows to exist in the last 8 years. But I don't see people walking around dressed up like Game of Thrones characters. But everybody wanted an Elvis haircut. And then everybody wanted a Beatles haircut and to wear Beatles-style clothing and and everybody wanted to become a musician. I just look at those two pop culture phenomena and think they're kind of unique in the whole history of what we're going to be talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that people don't appreciate as much, too, is that because there's so much out there now, a number one TV show like Game of Thrones or a number one musical artist, well, they're actually, in terms of absolute numbers, they're a lot farther down. They're not selling as much as the Beatles. Even a show like Game of Thrones is not being watched by as many people now as something like the Beverly Hillbillies in 1965, just because there's so much other choice out there available. So in terms of popularity, it may be popular than everything else, but it's not, in terms of absolute numbers of people tuning in and getting into it, it's not the same as it was when there was less choice available, when you had the whole country or the whole society sort of united in this one taste for this one artist or one event.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next point, too, when we talk about the digital age as being so influential. And I remember, growing up with 3 and at one point 13 channels to choose from on my television, 3 radio stations to choose from on my radio, and that was pretty much, and a newspaper, and that was pretty much all of the information and entertainment I was going to get. And I always found something to do or listen to or watch. Now with 400 channels on my television and infinite number of ways to listen to music, there's nothing that appeals to me. I'm not sure. Yeah, exactly. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
I mean, we're sort of swamped with choice now, and it's easier just to back away from it all. Like it's hard to make that and to get all the people united behind one particular taste. So I don't think there's any artist or any one movement nowadays that commands that can unify the population the way they did back 30, 40 years ago, pre-internet.
Let's set the stage because most of the folks that would be listening to this program probably, even if they were alive during 1966 to 1980, probably don't remember much about it. So they look at America and culture and the devices we carry around in our pockets that do everything for us and have a difficult time picturing what life was like during that time. So set the stage for us. What was our culture like at that point?
Well, the thing I get into in the book, Here's to My Sweet Satan, is that there was so much change happening politically and socially. There were so many crises and controversies going on. These were the days of the student protests, of Vietnam, of Watergate, of the energy crisis. There was a lot of problems affecting society, and there was a lot of divides even back then between different strands of society, but it was all being reflected. Instead of where everyone could go online and sort of post their own thoughts, it was all being reflected back at them. There was still that big monolith of culture, which was Hollywood movies, radio stations, the music industry, the publishing industry, which was still pretty big back then. So people it wasn't what people could say for themselves, but the kind of art or the entertainment that they could choose. And when you only had so much selection at the time of what kind of material you wanted to get into, the kind of stuff that was being produced was a good indication of what the public wanted or how the public was responding. So I think when you look at the history of what was coming out in this time, what was popular, it's a good indication of the public mood because that's what the public had. They couldn't make it for themselves. They had to take it from the industry that was out there.
I know one of the things that you talk about in your discussion here, and we will get into it obviously in much detail, but when you look at the late 60s into the early to mid 70s, you're looking at a period where entertainment took a particularly, I'll use the word evil turn, even though I don't mean it in the strictest definition of that word. You mentioned Rosemary's Baby being very popular, which is still one of my favorite movies of all time. Sure. And shortly after that, we saw The Exorcist become a very, very popular book and movie. And then shortly after that, the Amityville Horror made its debut as a book and then a movie. It seemed like there was a bit of a fascination with these satanic references and these stories that hinged upon that part of what we would consider to be the darker side of humanity.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's a big theme here. And one of the things I try to suggest is that different people who were making this stuff, whether they were musicians or filmmakers or authors, some people were sort of more serious than others about it. For some people, it was just kind of a gimmick, and definitely for Hollywood, a lot of people were just getting in on the bandwagon. And I go into the book about there's a lot of stuff that came in to just cash in on The Exorcist, for example, or The Omen. There was a lot of stuff that really wasn't all that great, but it was just kind of cluttering up the airwaves and the movie theaters at the time. But on the other hand, there were some people who were really seriously into it and were really trying to change minds with what they were producing. But definitely from the late 60s and all through the 70s, the occult or Satan or witchcraft, demonology, that was just good business, right? The paranormal. It did undergo a commercial wave at the time that for people trying to keep up with trends, you almost couldn't miss out on it. Everyone had to get in on it. I even get into things like toys, even Count Chocula cereal, Frankenberry cereal, like all that stuff. Everyone who wanted to sell something had to introduce an occult angle to it. Scooby-Doo, it was just so popular across so many different media that the trend caught on wider than anyone really could have expected. But the big pillars, the big tentpoles were things like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist and The Omen and the Amityville Horror and then first works of Stephen King. But there was so much else that came out around that time that was sort of trying to get in on the same wave.
The one of the things we have talked about at length on this program is the Amityville haunting, and some contend that was a product of the success of The Exorcist. And,
sure.
If you're familiar with the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine Warren, noted paranormal investigators, some say that those two saw this commercial success and decided to take a different angle with it. I guess we'd call it a reality angle, and look to do kind of the same thing. I don't know if your work got into that kind of thing specifically, but I think you've kind of touched on that when you talk about, you needed an occult angle, you needed a paranormal angle to be commercially viable.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in the book, I make a point, I'm not trying to prove or disprove anything here. But I think when you talk about something like the Amityville Horror or some of the other phenomena I go into, like the Bermuda Triangle, for example, Chariots of the Gods, I do think it's important to introduce the other side of the story, that at the time, yes, it was really popular. People got into it. It's a scary story, scary movie, but there are a lot of alternate explanations to what happened. And in the case of the Amityville Horror, I think that's been pretty convincingly shown to be that it was a bit of a hack work on the part of the author, Jay Anson, who wrote it back in 1977, and then I don't think anyone's ever been completely proved that there was a haunting happening at that place in Amityville, Long Island. So there's a lot of the stuff that when you tell the whole story, some of the mystery goes away. It's still interesting, it's still fascinating, and I think it's still important that people were as impressed by it as they were, but I don't want to approach it from the point of view of of being too credulous. Same with The Exorcist or The Omen and all that stuff, like interesting stories, but there is another side to it that has to be taken into account, that maybe takes away a little bit of the mythology from it.
Our guest tonight is George Case. We're talking about occult in pop culture, 1966 to 1980. He's written a book about occult. Here's to my sweet Satan. George, this is a short segment. I wanted to pick up on something you said because you mentioned the Bermuda Triangle, another topic that we talk about frequently on the program. And I also saw somewhere in your notes the television show In Search Of. It was it was in the early 70s, and that show is one of the shows that influenced me the most and kind of helped me determine what my career path was going to be. And frequently we have guests on the program that say the same thing. But that was a product of the same time frame that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a fascination back then with the sort of natural paranormal, not just the devilish stuff and the witchcraft, but also things like Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, ancient astronauts, Bermuda Triangle, the Mothman, all that. The unexplained, I think, was a big category that it fell into. It's fascinating stuff. I grew up in the same period, so I was interested by it. I found when I was researching it, though, that, of course, at the time and ever since, a lot of people have come up with alternate explanations of it. And the Bermuda Triangle is one of those ones that just hasn't really stood up to a lot of serious scrutiny. It's interesting to think that there is that area out there where ships and planes might disappear, but from all official accounts from the U.S. Coast Guard and other science-based organizations, they say no, it's just a statistical average that if anything's been lost there, it's just that's because of the amount of traffic that happens in that area off Florida, between Florida and Puerto Rico. So what's interesting to me is not whether or not the Bermuda Triangle is real or not. It's the fact that people thought it was, that people looked into it, that people created a whole sort of culture around it, including books and movies and everything, that there was a lot of people who, whether or not it is objectively real, were prepared to believe in it.
Yeah, I mean, there are some stories that still baffle people regarding experiences in the Bermuda Triangle, time slips and some other things that are still hard to explain, and we talk about those on the program. But I find, and we have just a couple of minutes here before our top of the hour break, but I find that as we talk about this and we start linking these ideas and things together, I never really noticed at how much there was these interests, whether it was occult and these pop culture things, started to add a little bit of fuel to the fire of what we would consider to be paranormal legends, Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot. We talked about the Bermuda Triangle. There's so many of those that really started to be noticed in the early 70s, I'd say.
Sure, and I think what happened, too, and I get into this in the book, is that a lot of them were kind of reinforcing each other. Like, if you were interested in Bigfoot, you were going to come across about the Bermuda Triangle eventually, too. It was on the same section of the bookstore, right? So if you were prepared to accept one, you almost had to kind of take an interest in the other because they all seemed equally mysterious, and there was a suggestion, too, from a lot of them that something was being hidden, something was covered up. People were sort of distrustful of authority and of the official line on anything. So at the time, if you couldn't take the government seriously because of Watergate, you had to wonder, well, what else are they not telling us? Which may have been something like cryptozoology, like the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, the Mothman, and then the Bermuda Triangle or ancient astronauts. So there was a lot of intrigue to it all, and I think the underlying view was, well, what's being covered up here? Maybe we're on the verge of some big discovery that we've just never encountered before. So at the time, because so much was being questioned politically and socially, I think rationalism and conventional science was just another avenue that people were starting to doubt.
And, of course, you made reference to Eric Von Daniken's book and then the following movie, Chariot of the Gods, which was another very influential film in my life and a lot of people's lives because it did open that whole ancient alien discussion. Right.
I mean, it turned people on to a lot of things about history and anthropology that maybe they hadn't really thought about before. Now, again, you can't avoid the fact that a lot of scientists and historians didn't really take it seriously and examined what Von Daniken was saying and said, this doesn't really hold up. There's not enough real evidence here. This isn't serious scholarship. But you can't discount the fact that millions of people were getting into it and in some way responded to it. I think that's more important socially or culturally than whether or not it's factually verifiable. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but the fact that it's a story itself that people got into, I think, is pretty important, whatever the real basis of it is underneath.
We'll be back with more of our discussion with George Case. He's the author of a book, Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture 1966 to 1980. It's Beyond Reality Radio.
Did you know that online retailers like Amazon have constant deals that can save you money on the things you buy every day? It's no joke. Save 40%, 50%, even 80% on great products, and all you have to do is know about them. Noodle Shark is the way to be alerted when something good is coming your way. Noodle Shark is the social media page that lists great deals that not only save you money, but give you the deals before anyone else has them. All you have to do is find Noodle Shark on Facebook. Search it as The Noodle Shark. That's The Noodle Shark, because you deserve to save too. Become a shark and save.
Thanks for being here with me. Jason has the night off tonight. We've got a great show underway. George Case with us. He is the author of a book that we've been talking about called Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture 1966 to 1980. We will be bringing him back into the show in just a moment. A couple things I want to mention. We've got some great guests coming up for the rest of the week. Tomorrow night, Gloria York will be here to talk about her book called Medical Manslaughter, Will Your Doctor Cause Your Death? And it's a true story based on her husband's death by medical error. Gloria outlines many supernatural experiences in the ordeal, including what she describes as the 6 miracles that took place. Wednesday, John Barber will be here Wednesday night. He's a Hollywood legend, the godfather of reality TV. He's an actor, a comedian, a TV host, and an author. And he's going to be talking about the Garrison tapes, never seen before documents provided by Garrison, James Garrison. And they're being released on John's YouTube channel through a series of online and face-to-face presentations. He'll be on the program Wednesday night. Of course, we're talking about James Garrison, who was the district attorney of New Orleans, and he brought charges, the only charges ever brought, by the way, in the JFK assassination. And then Thursday night, we've got 2 guests. The first hour, Jody Dean will be here to talk about being a paranormal investigator. Jody is a full-time YouTuber and has actually caught a full-bodied apparition during a live YouTube stream. That'll be an interesting conversation, particularly if you like to hear stories about paranormal investigating and ghost hunting. And then in the second hour of Thursday night's program, Ronnie Dawson will be with us to talk about his experiences as a UFO alien contactee and author. He is an alien home invasion survivor, among many, many other things. That'll be in the second hour of Thursday night's program. As I said, though, we've got George Case with us tonight, and we're talking about the occult and pop culture, 1966 to 1980. George, let's talk music here. Let's switch the topic to things like the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin. I mean, there are a lot of people that thought there was some evil coming out of those rock bands during that time. We'll talk about some of this, cite some of the specific examples, but was this stuff really evil, or was this just an overreaction?
I think it was pretty much an overreaction, but like we were speaking about earlier, how influential rock music was at the time, that was a pretty big reaction to have. There were millions of young people, millions and millions of young people getting into this music, so it didn't take much for the artists to put some sort of small reference to the occult or something spooky in their music, that it would just sort of go like a ripple through this vast public that they were reaching. So even if you go back as far as in 1967, when the Beatles had Aleister Crowley on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, it was just a little gesture on their part. They weren't really into it. They just thought it was something cool to do. But, I mean, that record sold 20 million copies, so there's 20 million pictures of Aleister Crowley out there in people's record collections. And then when the Rolling Stones put out Sympathy for the Devil, again, just it's a song. They were musicians. It's a great song, classic song we've all heard, but there again, it's another reference to the devil that's coming out. And when you get into Led Zeppelin, who were extremely popular throughout the 70s, putting on sort of these obscure runes on their covers, and Jimmy Page was, by his own admission, interested in the occult, and he at one point was living in one of Aleister Crowley's houses. it's hard not to respond to this for the public that was so fascinated by it. It didn't take much for the musicians to mention something like that the public could get into it and run with it. And in some cases, obviously, they took it farther than the musicians ever intended. For example, KISS, a lot of people thought KISS stood for Knights in Satan's Service. Had nothing to do with the intentions of the band, but that's what people were prepared to project their own feelings on that. And even the title of my book, Here's to My Sweet Satan, well, that was supposedly something that you could hear in Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven when it's played backwards. And again, the band always disowned it. They said it had nothing to do. They had no intention of putting backwards messages on their music, but people were so fascinated by their mystique that they could read anything into it at any speed or in any direction, and they were willing to take something occult from what was there.
I was going to ask you about the backward played music, because there was a period there where every album that came out from pop musicians was put on the turntable backward to see if there was some kind of hidden message there. Was there ever anything there, or was this all just a product of our imaginations?
Most of it was imaginations. I think eventually some bands knew that people were going to do that and would put stuff on there deliberately, but mostly it was just the audience kind of hoaxing itself. I mean, even with the Paul is Dead thing, which came out when the White Album came out in 1968 from the Beatles, there were people trying to decipher clues in there that Paul McCartney had been killed, and that had nothing to do with the Beatles' intentions. And then they took it to Led Zeppelin with Stairway to Heaven. It even went on to, I think, Judas Priest in one of their albums from 1978, and an Ozzy Osbourne album. So it was happening a lot, but the artists themselves always said if we really wanted to put backward messages on it, the first thing they would say is go buy more albums. They wouldn't put on anything so mysterious or dark. So it's a good example of how the audience themselves, the public, can kind of fool themselves based on a little bit of information coming from the performers, from the musicians themselves.
What role did a band like you mentioned, Ozzy Osbourne, or even someone like Alice Cooper, whose antics on stage were known to be somewhat, I'll say cutting edge, but I'm not sure which edge that is.
And everything,
yeah, I mean, how much did that play into all this?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, with Black Sabbath, they were laying it on so heavy with the song Black Sabbath and War Pigs. They were putting a lot of occult imagery in their music. And Alice Cooper with those epic stage shows with the guillotines and the baby dolls being crushed and the noose and the execution ceremonies. I mean, they were really pushing the envelope, particularly for the time. I mean, music and heavy metal music in particular has got a lot more provocative these days, but at the time you have to consider that was pretty shocking for by the early 1970s to have groups, long-haired hippie groups, playing loud heavy rock guitar and singing about Satan and dead babies and Halo of Flies and War Pigs. Like, that's pretty provocative at the time. So again, the audience heard that and took it far beyond what the musicians were really intending. In some cases, with people like Alice Cooper or Black Sabbath, they kind of knew they had a good thing going when they had it, and they were willing to milk it. And if you talk to them privately, they would have said, no, this is just a job, this is just our act, this is a show, and we know that the public likes it. But there's really no telling how the public is going to take it, and often they sort of expanded on the things they were getting from the music or from the stage shows.
Now, was it Alice Cooper? I don't remember. Or was this just urban legend? Didn't one of these artists bite the head off a bat on stage, or was that?
Well, that was Ozzy, and he really did do that. Someone threw a bat on stage, which sort of went immobile, and Ozzy thought it was a toy bat and bit it. But so he really did have to get rabies shots, I guess, for it. But again, a lot of this turned into good publicity, right? And particularly for rock stars, there's no such thing as bad publicity. So anything that makes them look controversial or dangerous or somehow provocative, they're going to take and run with it. Even KISS said they put out comic books in the 70s, which was supposedly printed in their own blood. So they made a lot of hay while the sun shined, and if people were going to respond to them in that way and think that there was something dark about it, they were savvy enough to go with that and to to play it up. I think even Jimmy Page said that, and I've got a quote from him in the book, like, he knows how much the mystique matters. He wasn't going to blow it now, and that he didn't want to undercut audiences' expectations, that if they were getting something like that from his music and buying the music, well, he wasn't going to disabuse them of any illusions.
Now, I know some of this gets into the time frame past what you've covered in the book, 1980, but heavy metal itself has always seemed to have had whether it's a natural connection to the occult or it's a contrived one. I'm not sure, but there seems to be a lingering connection between heavy metal music and this type of discussion. Was that born in this time frame?
Yeah, definitely through the 70s it kind of started. Like, I mean, rock and roll has always had that little bit of an edge to it, but I think with Zeppelin in particular, and Black Sabbath definitely, Blue Oyster Cult's another one, it started to become a real accepted genre within rock and roll, or a subcategory, and particularly with the heavy type of rock. So, and I get into this a bit in the book, like post-1980 when you had Metallica and Iron Maiden, Megadeth, Merciful Fate, Candlemass, Wasp, like all these people were really laying it on thick with pentagrams and inverted crosses, but it was almost as if they were just taking what the earlier artists had established and were just sort of turning the volume up on it. Same type of music, only a bit heavier, a bit faster, a bit louder, and same type of occult imagery, only just more blatant. Like, look at Motley Crue, Shout at the Devil by 1984, right? Like, they were putting pentagrams right on the album cover. So if it worked for one generation, by the next generation they were even just turning it up even more so. But it's definitely a staple theme of heavy metal rock, for sure.
George, that song, Beatles off the White Album, of course, Helter Skelter, was known to be, or cited to be, an inspiration for Charles Manson and his acts of hatred and cruelty in the Manson family. The Manson family murders, and then also the Jonestown Massacre. These were all headlines during the period that we're talking about here. How much did things like that contribute to all of this?
Oh yeah, I have a chapter of that in the book. I mean, it's not just that it was pop culture and entertainment and fun stuff. It was really having an impact among the real world, actually, and people were being killed and dying. I got the Jonestown Massacre. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, who was a real convicted killer. He had watched Rosemary's Baby. He claimed to be influenced by satanic forces. Manson himself had all kinds of weird occult connections, not in any real serious way, but definitely there was a link there between what he believed and what he was responding to. There was, and then of course when you go into the 80s, you get into things like Ricky Casso out on Long Island, the Say You Love Satan killers. It was having a real impact on people's lives. It wasn't just fun stuff and stuff that we were getting from pop culture. And unfortunately, some of it did turn pretty dark and into real crimes.
Another thing that was happening in popular entertainment and pop culture at the time was some pretty interesting television. Things like, and I'm not exactly sure where this falls in the timeline, but things like The Munsters and The Addams Family, and even Dark Shadows. This fascination permeated what we saw on network television as well.
Yeah, well, I was going into stuff like some of the TV movies at the time, and then there was The Night Stalker with
that's right.
Darren McGavin. So that was a big popular thing. And again, it was all about sort of showing people investigating these weird legends, but bringing them into the kind of contemporary reality. Now, the Munsters and the Addams Family were sort of earlier on in the 60s, and they were kind of like for comedic effect. But by the time of the 70s, it was being taken a bit more seriously, and there was always a question hanging over what was being investigated. Is this real or not? Or is there any truth to these things? Like, are they just superstitions, or is there some underlying reality? And with all the made-for-TV movies at the time, like Don't Be Afraid of the Dark is another one, sort of a classic from
one of my
period.
Favorites. That's one of my favorites, Don't Be Afraid of the Dark.
Classic movie, and again, Race with the Devil, that was a theatrical movie at the time, but it was the same idea that everywhere you turned, whether it was the big screen or the small screen, you were getting hit with these images of of the occult that were being taken kind of seriously. It wasn't just a joke, and it wasn't set in an old Transylvanian castle in the Middle Ages. It was always taking place here and now among ordinary people, which I think made it a lot more credible, because it seemed to be, it made it seem as if it could be existing alongside our ordinary reality. So it really messed with a lot of people's heads at the time.
Yeah, that Don't Be Afraid of the Dark was a made-for-TV movie. It's a very, very difficult one to catch anywhere. I've been looking for it for years, and I think you can actually buy it on DVD or Blu-ray. But if you're looking on any of the services like Netflix or Prime or even on YouTube, you just can't get it. You can't find it. And it's one I've been looking for a long time. That stuck with me.
Oh yeah, no, it's classic. I mean, the one thing I kind of keep repeating in my book is that whether or not it's serious or whether or not there's any basis in reality, these are pretty effective entertainments. Like Black Sabbath is a great band. The Exorcist is an excellent movie. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark is truly scary. Now, maybe there really aren't any things like little goblins living in your house and going to abduct you, but they do a pretty good job of, while you're watching it, convincing you that there could be. So whatever else it is, it was a good time for quality entertainment.
We're talking with George Case. We've got to jump to break here. We're going to continue the conversation on the other side of the break. But George, you've got a website and stuff. Where can people look for the book and get more information about your work?
I've got the book is available on Amazon, so you can always find it there. I've got an author page, and I also have an ongoing blog, George Case Blog at WordPress.com. And I know you've got some links there up there on your website to the show, so if people follow that, they'll get a hold of all my writing and my various the other books I've put out. George
Case is our guest. We're talking about his book, Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture, 1966 to 1980. Let's get back to the music part of this discussion, George. We often hear Beatles, we often hear Rolling Stone when we have these kinds of discussions. We hear Led Zeppelin. Some of the other groups we've already talked about, Kiss and others. But are there some that maybe not so obvious that had a bigger role in this, or is it just these, I would consider to be kind of mega groups that really were exhibiting this?
Well, there's a lot of groups getting in on it at the same time, and I think a lot of groups like The Doors may be another example of
right,
who are kind of exploring the dark side. And you pick out individual songs by different acts, like Born Under a Bad Sign by Cream, I think that's from 1968, the Graham Bond Organization. Now, there's a guy who was part of the British blues scene, but he actually considered himself or believed himself that he was Aleister Crowley's illegitimate son. So not a real successful group, but definitely a guy who was out there sort of conveying this occult ideas. Even AC/DC with Highway to Hell, a very popular band,
right,
obviously,
right,
but people attributed all kinds of occult ideas to them. So there was quite a few other groups. There was even a group called H.P. Lovecraft, which came out in the early 70s, kind of a weird space rock group, I guess, but they were named after the horror writer. So at the time, it was almost inescapable that anytime you turned on music, you were going to get some sort of spooky or mysterious or paranormal ideas coming to you through the medium of rock and roll. Alice Cooper, we talked about. I mean, like I say, a lot of times it was a gimmick on their part, but it did ripple outward among the audience that was there.
And once
David
again,
Bowie, he sang about Aleister Crowley on one of his songs.
Yeah, and once again, the time frame of the bulk of the book is 1980. But have we seen this taken to another extent with people like Marilyn Manson, and I probably can't even name some of the more appropriate band names for this discussion. But has it continued to move to an extreme?
Oh yeah, I think with all of heavy metal, like we were talking about, they do there's a formula to it, and a lot of the more recent groups like Avenged Sevenfold, Cradle of Filth, Merciful Fate, Wasp, Exodus, Venom. I mean, those people were really putting it out there, taking the stuff that Black Sabbath did and just amping it right up. So yeah, and they're getting pretty nasty. It's not personally for my taste. I sort of draw the line at Judas Priest or Metallica or somebody, but definitely each generation of hard rock groups seems to be just pushing it a little further. The music is louder, faster, and the themes are even more dark. And apparently there really have been some of those groups, like in Europe, who really did get into serious devil worship and weird kind of cult affiliations. So what started off as kind of just an act for people like Alice Cooper, for some of the later groups and the lesser-known ones, they really were taking it seriously. They were living it as well as singing about it.
The time frame in your book is 1966 to 1980. Let's talk about 1966 for a second. Was there a pivotal event in 1966 that made you start there?
The first thing I started with in the book was that in April of that year, it was about 53 years ago this week almost, or last week, Time magazine put out a cover where it said, "Is God Dead?" It was the first time the magazine didn't put an actual human face on the cover. So you can imagine the impact that might have had on the newsstands if everyone's going to their local library or their bookstore and the first thing they see is red letters against the black background, "Is God Dead?" Like, that's pretty confrontational for 1966, and I think that was almost like the ground zero of when people started doubting conventional religion, conventional reality, conventional forms of faith and belief, because if God was dead, well, that left a lot of room for a lot of God's rivals and the other superstitions that had been ignored by conventional religion. So I sort of consider that as the starting point in 1966. And also, that was the same year that Ouija boards started being retailed by Parker Brothers. They'd always been around for years before that, but here they were becoming really commercialized. And then the next year, just early in 1967, Anton LaVey founded the Church of Satan. So there was a whole wave of stuff just within a few months period where suddenly the occult and devil worship and the paranormal were just confronted with, were just put front and center in the public consciousness.
Let's go to our listener line here. This is John in Gainesville, Florida. Hi, John. Welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks. We'll like to talk about AC/DC, blues, all these modern day bands talking about the devil and stuff like that. But one of the great folklores is Robert Johnson, who has great songs like the Graveyard Blues, Hellhound on My Tail, and talking about the devil.
Absolutely, yeah. I reference him a little bit in the book. Like, he was one of the early blues masters, the pioneer of the blues, and he had stuff like Hellhound on My Trail, If I Had Possession Over Judgment Day. So, and he had that whole legend about the selling his soul to the devil, which got later translated to something Led Zeppelin supposedly did. So, yeah, when it comes to the occult in music and in guitar-based blues music, Robert Johnson, you have to give him a lot of credit.
Thank you for that call, and that's a great observation, John. We appreciate you listening in Gainesville. Is there a correlation between volume and suspected or implied occultism here? In other words, the louder the music, the louder the music, is there a natural tendency to attribute some occult traits to it?
Yeah, well, I think as with everything else, every other type of medium, just as the volume, the impact, the sensory overload becomes heavier, the occult themes are harder to miss. Like with something like Led Zeppelin, with Stairway to Heaven, it starts off acoustic and then ends at kind of hard rock. So somewhere in there's a mysterious, possibly occult message that people responded to. But when you get into something like a Slayer or Slipknot, like the guitars are so heavy, the volume is so loud that it's kind of impossible to miss what they're singing about. Merciful Fate, Candlemass, all those people, like it's pretty blatant what they're doing with their music at that point.
In your book, do you take a look at? I know you mentioned Watergate, but are there more political implications in any of this?
The big political implication that I can see and that I get into is that the occult kind of contributed to the rise of the Christian right, at least in the United States, because there was that whole phenomenon of Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth, which was sort of taking biblical themes and the idea of the apocalypse and end times and giving it a kind of relevance that a lot of people hadn't really thought about before. But that was a huge selling book, and that did promote a kind of Christian evangelicalism, which really took off. It had a huge political influence in the United States and continues to this day, I would say. So by making the Bible and religion and traditional forms of faith, where there was kind of a good guy, God versus the devil, and making that so relevant in the popular mind, a lot of people did respond to that politically, and it was reflected in the voting patterns. So absolutely, the occult permeated and reverberated outward into real politics. It wasn't just fun and entertainment and movies and music, but it did have an impact on who was running the country, basically.
Some folks in our chat room have mentioned Stevie Nicks as an artist who has claimed to be a witch or be involved in witchcraft. Is that part of this discussion as well?
I know about Stevie Nicks and the rumors of her as being sort of a white witch, I guess. I think that's an example of the audience projecting a lot of things on what the artists were doing. For her, it was probably something that she mentioned once or twice. I don't think it's something that is a big part of her career or her work, but it says more about we as an audience want to get from our favorite musicians more than what the musicians themselves were doing. And, nothing against Stevie Nicks. She's talented. Fleetwood Mac are a great band, and good luck to her. But I think it's interesting how much we as the listeners want to get something from her career that maybe she hadn't really intended us to receive so much.
We're going to run out of time here in just a few minutes. I want to just take briefly a second here and talk about the other books that you have written that might be of similar interest, maybe not about occult, but certainly musicians, because you've done some work in addition to what we're talking about tonight.
Yeah, I've done a couple of other books on Led Zeppelin. I had a biography of Jimmy Page come out, which gets into his own occult interest, including into Aleister Crowley, which that's sort of a starting point for what we're talking about here. Like, even Page has admitted, I was into it and I liked it, but I didn't put backward messages on the music. And I've got a book called Led Zeppelin FAQ, which also delves into the occult connections, real or not, in Led Zeppelin. And another book called Out of Our Heads, Rock and Roll Before the Drugs Wore Off, which is about rock music and the drug culture in roughly the same period that we're talking about here, like 60s, 70s, where it was Hendrix, the Grateful Dead, Pink Floyd. And that, again, had a pretty big impact on how we think today when so many musicians were singing about being high or promoting some or another form of psychedelic experience.
One other thing that's a bit off topic, but it is pertinent to things being discussed today, is the documentary about Motley Crue. And I know you have an opinion about it because you wrote about it. A lot of people seem to like it. A lot of people are talking about it. What are your thoughts?
I saw it the other night. It's not bad. I mean, the thing about Motley Crue is that, as we were talking about with other heavy metal groups, they're kind of following in the footsteps of work that other people had done already, whether it's Stones or Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath. I like some of the Motley Crue songs, and it's not a bad movie, but I think the story has been played out by better artists before them. I mean, sex and drugs and rock and roll was not something that was invented by Motley Crue. If you were on tour with the Stones in 1972 or Zeppelin in 1975 or even, the Beatles in 1965, you're probably going to see a lot of debauchery then too. So it's not something that Motley Crue invented, and I think by the time they were doing their thing, it was something that almost everyone was doing, including Wall Street traders and sitcom actors. So, nothing against Motley Crue, but they're not my favorite act, and I think a lot of other bands did that same thing better and first.
We are going to be giving away a copy of the book from your publisher. Again, the book is called Here's to My Sweet Satan, How The Occult, Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture, 1966 to 1980. We're going to take the third caller on our listener line at 844-687-7669 to do that as we continue our conversation here for a couple more minutes with George. Since we're on the idea of music-related biopics, what about the one that caused quite a stir last year, Bohemian Rhapsody, the look at Freddie Mercury?
Well, I think Queen are a great band. They've got a huge catalog of excellent music. The movie itself, I think it's very hard to tell the whole story of a rock band that was around for 10 years or more and condense that into a 2-hour movie. I'm a sucker for rock and roll biopics, but if you're into the band at all or the artist at all, you're going to find something that just didn't make it into it. You're going to say that technically was wrong, or that didn't happen, or they didn't use that kind of guitar, or he didn't look like that. So
right.
As a fan, you're always going to be able to find little nits to pick. So I'm sure there's going to be more rock and roll biopics like that, like Bohemian Rhapsody and like The Dirt about Motley Crue. But if you're really into the band, it'll never seem to do them quite as much justice as you think they deserve.
Did I see that there is one, or there was one being made about Elton John? Did I see something about
I can believe it, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, he'll be next. And again, there's a lot of music there and a lot of story. But it's sort of down to, do they have the right guy to play him? And can they really condense that whole story, that whole life into 2 hours that includes all the best anecdotes and the best music of one career? Like, that's going to be hard to do, but I know there's an audience for it because these artists were so huge in their time, and they have such big followings today.
So if someone was to go to your list of books on your author page, is this the one you recommend they start with, or would you recommend they start somewhere else?
Well, Here's to My Seat, Swayton is my most recent book, and I think they'll find between all of them some similar themes about pop culture and movies and music. I'm coming at it from a lot of the same perspective. But Here's to My Sweet Satan I would start with. That's the one that's widely available. But I've got other ones on Stanley Kubrick, on Jimmy Page, on Led Zeppelin, rock and roll. So whichever catches your fancy, they're all available. They're all for sale. And
they're on Amazon. And your website, which has your blog, is georgecaseblog.wordpress.com?
Correct. That's where I am.
All right. Well, George, it's been a fascinating discussion. I thank you so much for joining us, and I think it was kind of a last-minute thing, too. But I really enjoyed it. Hope you'll come back sometime.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me.
All right. We're going to take a break. We come back. We'll wrap things up. It's Beyond Reality Radio. I'm J.V. Johnson.
Please support the program. Go to patreon.com/Johaw. That's Johaw.
Thank you to George for being on with us. It was a last-minute schedule change, and he was able to come on, and a great job to Orion as well, who recommended George as a guest. So that all worked out tremendously. Joseph Whaley of Evansville. I shouldn't have said the last name, but I didn't mean to that. We had Joseph in Evansville, Indiana, won the book, copy of George's book, Here's to My Sweet Satan, How the Occult, Haunted Music, Movies, and Pop Culture, 1966 to 1980. So congratulations. Don't forget, tomorrow night, Gloria York, who is the best-selling author of a book called Medical Manslaughter, with Will Your Doctor Cause Your Death? She'll be with us. It's a true story based on her husband's death by medical error. Gloria outlines many supernatural experiences in the book, including what she describes as the 6 miracles that took place during the whole ordeal. And then Wednesday, John Barber will be here to talk about the Garrison tapes, never seen before documents provided by James Garrison, are being released on John's YouTube channel. And that'll be Wednesday night's program. So a lot of great stuff coming up. Please stop by our Facebook page, like it, Beyond Reality Radio. Stop by my Facebook page, JVJ Paranormal, or just JV Johnson. And please subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is also JV Johnson on YouTube. I'd like to see you involved in all of those things. So thank you again for being here tonight. It's Beyond Reality Radio. I'll see you all tomorrow.
Beyond Reality Paranormal is hosted by JV Johnson and produced by Orion Palmer and Slick Eddie Edwards. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please consider supporting the program either through your podcast platform, click on the link in the description, or on Patreon at Joha Productions. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Paranormal, or you have a recommendation for a guest, contact our producer, Slick Eddie Edwards. Eddie is spelled with a Y at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com.